Welcome to O Types Rising, the podcast where we dive deep into the minds of big picture thinkers who thrive on curiosity, dot connection, and challenging the status quo. I'm your host, Jen Rice. In each episode, we'll explore the strengths, strategies, and challenges of O Types who are shaping the future of business. All right. Welcome. We're having a curious conversation with John Durrant. He is the co-founder of Human-Centric Engineering. John, you used to run engineering teams. What are the challenges and problems that you saw that inspired you to start this company?
A lot of challenges that are faced in software engineering are actually sort of people problems, people and relationships. And I've noticed that those aspects tend to get brushed over or avoided or taken for granted or addressed with false assumptions. And I think that for me is where the depth of interest lies. And that's the real kind of, I wouldn't say problem to solve. It's the context to understand. And then you can start thinking about how you then layer solutions on top of that context.
You were saying that engineering is more all about relationships, which I had never thought of it that way.
Software engineering, no longer an individual pursuit. I guess the Hollywood depiction is like of this brilliant hacker, that's typing at 100 miles an hour and screens flashing. And that's just so far from reality in terms of how software is developed. So these days, software is really a collaborative sport. And that makes sense because you don't want all of these sort of institutional knowledge residing in one person's head. You want to spread it around a team and spread it around an organization. And software itself is no one person can see the whole. So it does involve a number of stakeholders in defining, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What customer issues are we trying to address? What's the value we're trying to create? What's the business hypothesis going in? The software engineer will translate into code. So all of that stuff front loads the software development process. But then actually developing code it's a really nuanced area. There are so many interdependencies within software systems themselves. You have to have an eye on the parts and an eye on the whole and how it all fits together. So that all depends on the quality of relationships that you develop in the teams and in the business. And one thing that I find interesting is that the delivery mechanism of software is people and relationships. And if those are of a poor quality, if people aren't communicating or coordinating, then you'll get a slow sort of process of value delivery to the end customer.
One of the things that we were talking about is putting people into boxes, right? And assuming that they are just specialists in their own domain. And then the process of just getting customer insight into the development process is this game of telephone because the engineers aren't that connected into that front end of really understanding what the customer problem is.
Yeah, it varies from company to company. Some companies, this kind of customer proximity is quite low, and that means that the engineer is more of a cog in the machine, and they are there to do a kind of specialized task, which isn't necessarily what engineers want. And it's not. I don't think it's empowering for them, and I don't think it creates their sense of connection and meaning in relation to their work, and it doesn't leverage their skills in terms of when things are sort of chopped up in a very sort of industrial, mechanical kind of way, and each person is responsible for a small component. It leads to a kind of a fragmented approach and a fragmented system. And what I found is that engineers are very interested in the bigger picture stuff. Often, they're not always these specialists that we think that they might be. So they're creating that connection to the customer and realizing that software engineers can make sense of a situation, can make their own decisions around the best approach according to the contextual information. I think that's really important, not only for developing better software, but actually creating an environment where software engineers enjoy their work and they get meaning from it.
One of the things we were talking about was the characteristics of O-types, very curious and much more of a, let's say, systems thinker, and thinking in terms of the wholes and not individual parts. And software engineers definitely are more for the most part, holistic, system-minded thinkers. It's what drew them to this particular line of work in the first place. And many of them are really curious. You were telling me that many of them have a lot of O-type capacities, which means they're curious about philosophy and business and the opportunities that they could have to add a lot more value to the business is not often there.
Yeah, it's an unleveraged potential, I think. And it's really interesting. I've worked in different spheres myself. I've worked in more commercial, front-end customer-facing roles. I've run my own business, and then I've worked with software engineering teams. And I've found that software engineers are often a mischaracterized, misunderstood sort of enigma. So, and I've had some of the deepest conversations that I've had with people, with software engineers, because they really are interested in the depths of topics and the breadth of topics. And so, yes, you can have really great conversations about human psychology and social systems and philosophy and morality and ethics. And all of those relate to a kind of ecology. And I think that it's really important to understand the value of not putting somebody in a box and restricting them to sort of swim in their own lane, and to understand that people are curious and want to sort of explore things outside of their lane. But it's hard sometimes especially in software, it's very high pressured situation. There's this pressure to deliver. There's a lot of venture capital involvement that puts extra pressure on the need to see results, etc. So often it's because I think there's a lack of time and patience to ask questions, understand the perspective of software engineers. But if you do spend that time, if you do that inquiry into what is the perspective from the engineers themselves and actually sort of bring that out, I think that provides a hell of a lot of rich, deep information upon which to then, take other decisions.
Yeah, I was reading about Palantir and how they organize, and most of the organization is forward deployed engineers. The engineers they just put on customer site to solve a really specific customer problem, which seems to be the heart of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think there's real value in self-organizing systems. This is an area I'm really interested in. Just a slight tangent outside of software, in terms of the ecology of things. And I mean, look at the human body. Okay, I've got an immune system that's working without me really thinking about it. I've got a cardiovascular system. There's all these processes inside your body that are sort of going on in a self-organized way to maintain with individual incentives and individual pieces of information that come together to make the whole. And that's the same in our businesses, in the ecology of the world, in our economies. And what you were describing with Palantir, for example, that sounds like a situation where the engineers have been trusted to find out for themselves, to do the discovery, to kind of work out in a self-organized, self-deterministic kind of way what needs to be done. And that requires this kind of a decentralized model of trust and empowerment, autonomous teams with a clear primary goal and the right sort of support and conditions to be effective and do what needs to be done, can be left to get on with it and find their own way. I think it's quite hard to really understand how that might work. And I think some people struggle with that. But again, another software example, I'm thinking about a Bitcoin ecosystem. So we're talking today, and Bitcoin is almost going to go to about $100,000 per coin. And how did it get there? There's no Bitcoin organization. There's no one in control. There's no marketing department. People aren't coming in and intervening and adjusting the code. It works because it's autonomous and self-organizing. Each part of the Bitcoin network has a clear incentive, and it works in a certain way so that it contributes to a kind of a cohesive whole. And I think that is a really good metaphor for managing teams, and in a way that what emerges from that, this idea of emergence, is customer value that couldn't have been foreseen or predicted by just one centralized person. So that's the kind of vision and challenge and the way to work with teams, but it's not easy. It requires a lot of trust and clarity and all the right conditions for that to work.
I love this conversation. It's one of my favorites. And there's this assumption, I think, among a lot of people that I talk to, this difference between centralized and decentralized, full control or total chaos. And I like to say there's always a third way between two false binary options. And there really is a way to get them working together. It's much more of creating the possibility space. What is the intention? What are the boundaries of the system? What are we doing? What are we not doing? And that obviously has to be driven from the top, making sure that incentives are aligned. So really thinking much more using the systems-based approaches to ensure the wholeness and coherence and intention of the system, which is to create value. And so that value creation is actually what defines the balance of the system. And within that, then you can start letting go of control and start empowering people who really know how to create that value.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about software is that it is an industry that is throwing up lots of solutions and lots of ways of doing that. And the question is, how do you create sort of enabling structures and enabling conditions for autonomously, purposefully directed people to know what to do in those situations? And I think that one of the really interesting structures that has come out of technology space that might be interesting for other people in other spheres is something called team topologies. You've probably not heard of that. It's a methodology by a couple of people, Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton. And they have looked at the most simple way of defining certain types of teams and how those types of teams can be connected to each other within a whole ecosystem, so that it's really clear when you're in a certain team, you know what your purpose is. You know who you're serving. Are you serving another team? Are you enabling another team? Or they have this idea of a stream-aligned team, which is like one team that is delivering a certain part of value to a customer. And that stream-aligned team kind of has end-to-end responsibility for being able to go right from the start of thinking about a customer problem all the way through to the development, the testing, to the deployment and release of that code, and then to get the feedback from the customer so that they can be really responsive to that customer feedback. And then they have other teams that are serving that team from a platform perspective, for example. So you might have a platform team that is saying, okay, what do I need to do to make this stream-aligned team really successful? By having this kind of clear approach to organizational structure, it means that you are kind of like creating the conditions for this cohesive whole to emerge. It's a framework that's been around now for about 5 years, and I think it's pretty much remained in tech, but it's the kind of thinking that would be really beneficial outside of tech to structure ourselves in a really clear, cohesive, coherent sort of way that just lets teams be autonomous and able to make sense of their part of the world, make decisions in a way and take actions that will mean that the end result is better than it would have been had you had this kind of like very strict control all along the way.
Well, I think one thing that O-types do really well is port different ideas from one area to another area. So this whole idea of platforms, I've been looking at, so often it's associated with just business models, but I think borrowing concepts from technology in terms of full stack, where, an organization is not divided into vertical silos, but rather it's more about stacking on top of a foundation of what is the value to be created, what are the non-negotiables, and then how do we actually stack on top of that? Ultimately, platforms are simply foundations, immovable foundations for an ecosystem to sit on top of, right? The platform provides the rules for the ecosystem, and every business is inherently an ecosystem. So even platforms are used in product manufacturing. So this idea of modularity pulling in. So I think there's lots of really interesting ideas from different places that can apply internally into how an organization works.
Yeah, and I think fundamental to that is thinking, what, how does that serve? How does that serve our human needs in a way, and our human fallibilities, and everything that we'll get wrong and everything that we'll get right, according to the quality of the platform and how it interacts, and what that means for the relationships that we will develop within that platform and or on top of that platform. And they're not easy questions to answer at all. And I think a lot of the time it's like there's no silver bullet. I was talking about team topologies. That's not a silver bullet that's going to just magically solve every problem and get rid of any tension, conflict, and everything's to be happy. I think that there's an ongoing sort of negotiation or an ongoing conversation that's needed in any organization that is kind of reflexive and looks inward and allows for adjustments and adaptability and those kind of things. So yeah, that whole thing of complexity with a blueprint platform or a model or something just isn't going to work. One of the problems in leadership is knowing what's right and sort of imposing a level of control that is aligned with your beliefs and your prejudices and those kind of things. And how do we get that out of the way so that there's an ongoing conversation and negotiation and adaptability within the whole ecosystem?
When you were saying that blueprints and platforms are not effective, can you clarify what you mean? 'Cause it seems
I
like
think
that is what's needed, but maybe what you're saying is it's not enough?
I think that there's often the misconception that you can look at what Palantir does, or you can look at what Amazon or Spotify does and say, right, okay, they've got a certain model or framework that they're using. Let's use that one, and sort of trying to then make the bits fall into place. But I think every company has every situation is situational or contextual, and good cities emerge through adapting and growing organically, and cities that we've tried to design, no matter how well intended, they're not going to be as functional and natural as a city that's sort of organically grown. And I think you can apply that to any system. And trying to impose a templated, silver bulleted sort of framework onto a situation and expecting the same result isn't going to get you anywhere. But that's not to say that there aren't certain sort of methodologies or approaches or ideas or concepts or models that are useful, but they have to be applied in a contextual way. And the only way you understand the context is by listening to people, getting people involved, getting them to the ground and finding out what's really going on and what you're really dealing with. And I think that there's a context gap often when we try to bring these models in. And as Donella Meadows in her systems thinking would always talk about the paradigms and the mindsets within a system being the things with great leverage. And that's all in people's attitudes and beliefs. And unless you consider those in any solution and give them space to breathe, then the imposition of a framework could backfire and give you unintended consequences.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's well said. One of the things that I've done in consulting is how do you get all the teams aligned around value creation, not on the outputs that their function or team or department produces, and creating that line of sight from everybody directly to the value to be created for whom seems to just unlock a lot of magic and efficiencies and productivity, everything.
Yeah. And again, it's not just something that it would be done by managers. And
Right.
again, this could be a mistake that's made when a manager comes in and says, right, this is how we're delivering value and this is where it goes. If it's participatory, if the stakeholders within the value stream are involved in saying, well, yes, this is how we deliver value. This is who we depend upon. And it's mapped out in a way that people doing the work can understand. Then they've got a sense of ownership and a stake in that process. And that's the aim of team topologies in a really simple way to align team structure to value delivery. There are some parts that can be sectioned off, for example, a complicated subsystem team. So one part of the solution that maybe is very specialist. So say you've got a specialist in I don't know, machine learning or AI or in data or in a particular gnarly sort of software problem. That complicated subsystem would have a team of specialists, a team of, I types or T types that would only focus in that particular area and deliver that subset as a service or as a collaboration with the main team. So the whole priority all the while is thinking about this flow of value. How do you make the team delivering the flow of value? How do you take away their cognitive load? How do you take away their bottlenecks? And how do you connect them to the customer in a way that they can make sense? So one of the authors, Matthew Skelton, he came from control systems where you have sensors, so electronic control systems that are quite autonomous. And so his whole thing was about how do you do organizational sensing as a team, almost like a nervous system, so that you can be responsive in terms of like seeing a situation and actually having the authority and the capability to respond to it. So when a customer says, this doesn't work, or that I want something to work this way, that team can then quickly respond without having to go through this horrible chain of team A, team B, team C to get something back out to the customer.
So OTIDEs generally play at the intersection. So we're not specialists, or we're specialists in connection, if you will. But we tend to not want to be in a box. We see how all the things are connected. So having people not just at the top, but deeper in the organization, helping to serve that interconnection, working alongside specialists, because we need specialists. But I think the org models of today have over-rotated on over-specialization, and we're lacking that kind of the connective tissue, the people who are able to see, not just at a senior level, but at all the levels, how the whole thing could work better. I'm curious if you've seen that in practice.
Yeah. So actually in practice, I think what I've seen more of is, as what you're describing, that you've got a role, you've got a job title, you've got a area of responsibility, and it's not just in software engineering. I think it's everywhere. That becomes your identity, it becomes you, and it can be limiting. It can be both empowering for certain types of people, but limiting for other types of people, which feeds back into your work. But if you are somebody that does want to have tentacles that explore other areas of the business or other possibilities, then it can be a pretty frustrating place to be. I do know some brilliant software engineers that they say how much they struggle because they're just restricted to an area, and then they do their side projects. They'll be in this constricted area in their work on the 9 to 5, and then in the evenings and weekends they'll have other side projects that can showcase their wider capabilities.
Yeah. And I think it was Sam Altman said that good founders need to be generalists. But the challenge is there's not a lot of training in any organization to really get that kind of capability to be able to move up. And as you get promoted within a typical organization, understand how the whole thing works. There's very little training for that. So then you have these people who are trapped, who are really smart and really talented, and then they leave to go compete with your company as a startup founder.
Yeah. I wonder if it's training that's needed, or if it's more sort of permission or more sort of acceptance. Do you think that you can train for kind of wider, more systems and complexities of appreciation? Or is it a capacity you develop through exposure to life?
Well, for me, for example, I started my career in customer-facing areas, brand, CX, innovation. But I have a natural, curious, connecting mind. So every time I get a new piece of information or I work on a new kinds of project, it feeds into my mental model of how things work. So the deeper I got into the organization and started mapping people, processes, technologies, operating models, business models, and the more exposure I got, the larger my mental model got, and I was able to actually see how everything needed to be aligned around customer value. I don't think everybody has the capacity to do that. I came up with this term O-type really because I didn't see anything else out there that described either how I worked or the people that I coached worked. So there's the high curiosity and the high capability of working in systems and really seeing the whole system is I think very much a function of brain wiring. And yes, I believe in neuroplasticity. Yes, I believe that if you're curious enough, you can learn and really see and grow. And so I think it benefits everybody to get cross training, but especially for the people who don't like sitting in a box, having permission, huge. The one thing that is consistent across all the O types I talk to is everybody's told to stay in their lane because all the specialists resent our presence because we're continually coming into other people's areas saying, oh, here's how this could work better. Here's how we can work better together. I think we've all run into these challenges. And so it kind of makes us say, fine, we're not welcome here. We're going to go leave and run our own shows.
Yeah, I always found that I felt like when I would go out of my lane or ask questions or point to things that I was seeing, and I would try to point to reality, this is the reality. And whenever I would do that, I felt often that I was seen as a bit of a dissenter or a rebel or troublemaker. And maybe I think that my approach when I was younger wasn't very subtle. I wasn't so aware of political sensitivities and, I'd just blunder in and say things that I saw without thinking about the other person's perspective or the other person's goals or their scope of operation or whatever. So I've kind of learned that lesson, I suppose, the hard way. But equally, I still remain frustrated that it's great now that I'm running my own company and I'm working with somebody that is quite similarly wired to me, and there's a great sense of freedom there to explore the areas that you're interested in. I feel like if I was to go back into a corporate setting, I would be very lucky to find a corporate setting that actually I felt comfortable in terms of being able to ask those difficult questions or point to those things. And I think there are some out there, definitely. But yeah, tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a whole cultural component here. So, thinking about being an O type, often what I find when you lose the structure of working within a typical organization and you go out on your own and you're leading your own company, because we're naturally curious and because we see opportunities and possibilities and challenges to fix everywhere, how to stay focused. Do you run into that and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I think I've got a tendency to always keep researching and keep delving, and then that you have to draw things to an end, and you have to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, right, this is where we are now, and this is what we're doing, or this is what we're delivering, for example. So yeah, trying to rein yourself in is quite a discipline. And my colleague Simon and I, we're seeing like a whole range of opportunities and things that we could be focusing on. And if I'm honest, we're probably doing too many things at once. However, we are having a continual conversation about what's the best thing to be prioritizing. So we're kind of, constraining each other a little bit, and that's quite helpful. So yeah, having somebody else to kind of bounce off and to negotiate where we should be focusing is really helpful. Because otherwise, just left to my own devices, I'd go off on too many launch pads.
Yeah. What I've seen other folks do, or let's say successful founders, once you really get the value that you're going to deliver, that value doesn't change. For example, in Chesky's recent interview about Airbnb, they are all about helping these curious explorers feel like a local, always feeling like a local. And that value to be created actually forms the container, if you will. So all these ideas that fall outside of that, like starting a hotel chain, it makes it easier to know what to say no to. I talk
Yeah.
about creating possibility spaces for people like us, which gives us a bit of a playground but there's still some clear container walls.
Yeah, yeah. We, I think, are doing the same kind of thing. We're coming back to what are the core principles, and at the heart of it all, it's like what we're doing is we are interested in getting on the ground with the engineers, providing the contextual meaning from the perspective of software engineers from their day-to-day work. And I think that kind of keeps us grounded.
Yeah. It feels like there's a big part of your work that's not just with the software engineer, but rather how to make sure that the entire organization understands how to leverage software engineering better and closing that software to value gap, which is a bigger value proposition.
Yeah, you've got to start from where you are. And I think a lot of people in managerial positions will have a different view of the world to people on the ground. And so what we find is that we're quite good at using structures and methodologies to surface the perspective and the reality of what's actually sort of happening in the field. And without that, you can't do good decision making or good direction taking. What are the everyday struggles and bottlenecks or constraints that they face that are disabling them from doing their job? So where is the waste? What are the frustrations? As well as what are the joys? What are the motivators? We actually use the lens of self-determination theory through which to have our conversations with engineers. Are they able to apply a sense of mastery to their work, a sense of craftsmanship? Are they learning? Do they feel that their work is professional? Um, Self-determination theory is really around mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So then we go into autonomy. Do they have the clear information flows? Do they have the decision-making authority? Do they have the right tools for the job? Do they have the clear purpose to sort of know what they're supposed to be doing? And then we look at purpose itself. Do they feel a connection to the customer? Do they feel a sense of belonging within the company? How do they relate to each other? What are the relationships like? Are they full of tension, conflict, or are those situations easily resolved? So it's through that lens of self-determination theory that we'll talk to engineering teams and then produce a mix of qualitative and quantitative information to senior leaders to say, well, look, this is the situation as we see it through the eyes of the engineers. Only from there can you then decide, well, what are the next steps? How are there changes that need to be made? Is there a different way of working that would benefit people? All depends on the context.
Yeah. Got it. And so the outcome or the value-based outcome would be
that you're then making informed decisions based on reality. Leaders are looking for organizational performance, and lagging metrics for that kind of revenues, profit, and customer satisfaction scores and customer retention and customer acquisition, all of those kind of things. And so that's all downstream. Our proposition is that you only get those downstream results by asking, how well are we set up for success upstream? So by looking at the culture of engineering teams, by looking at how they're working, by looking at what it feels like from the view of the software engineer, what does it feel like to do your work? Those sorts of questions need to be answered to know if you have the right sort of structures and the cultures and that you're set up for that downstream success.
I love that because then that value of we're unlocking engineering team performance, boom, that's it. As long as you're staying in that zone, that's your value-based container, and anything that doesn't serve that gets discarded.
Yeah.
But that also leaves a lot of opportunity for lots of different kinds of services when moving into more executive teams versus just the engineering team. And it still leaves a lot of possibility.
Yeah. And also unlocking the engineering team performance also has a feedback loop that then is positively reflected in self-determination. A happy engineering team is a productive engineering team, and a productive engineering team is a happy engineering team.
Nice. I love that. So in closing, for us to wrap all this, what kind of advice would you give to whom?
I think human beings want to feel powerful, and it's like Nietzsche's will to power. And we feel good when we have power. And I think that means that we come to the world wanting things to sort of go our way and to impose ourselves on other people. But the world doesn't work most effectively in that way. Often it's about letting go of power, letting go of the need for control, and trying to work out how you could enable other people to complement what it is that you're trying to do. And that goes against the ego. It's, the ego wants power in a situation, the ego wants control, and that serves us well, in terms of survival and life, but not necessarily so well when we're working in a collaborative setting and we're producing something together. So it's how do you overcome a lot of those natural sort of drives and desires and need in order to have the more sort of successful outcome together.
I love that. That's such a great note to wrap on. John, thank you so much for joining the podcast. This was amazing as always.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me to come along.